This is the first movie in a long time that I can remember going into completely blind. I never saw a trailer, I didn't read too much about it beyond a very basic synopsis. Add to that, with the exception of maybe Lord of the Flies and more recently Yellow Jackets, I'm not really a fan of man vs. wild or survival stories. Let me tell you, I was blown away by this movie, and there are scenes that have stayed with me 3 weeks later. You'll be sobbing with joy, frustration, heartbreak, you'll cheer, you'll be at the edge of your seat and anxiety. This is such an emotional roller coaster, and I can't explain it, but it was as though I'd forgotten that I was even watching a movie in a way. What an exhilarating and profoundly moving experience. I know it sounds like I'm overselling it. Really, I'm not. I would highly recommend this. Anyway, on to the video. On October 13th, 1972, a Uruguayan plane carrying 40 passengers and 5 crew crashed into the Andes Mountains. We go back in time then, earlier in October of that year, to a rugby game. In the change room later, and the next scenes, we see that the boys are collecting money for an upcoming plane ride for a trip to Chile, and this is where they'll be playing a match. Two of the boys are kind of closer friends, Numa and Gaston tells Numa that this could be their last trip together before Numa graduates law school in a few months and life gets serious. Eventually it's the day of the trip and the boys say their goodbyes to some of their families and loved ones as they get ready to leave Montevideo for Santiago, Chile. 24-year-old Numa, previously mentioned Numa, is the narrator for this movie. There's chatter, there are a lot of laughs and jokes on the flight, and there's also a little turbulence, but this is normal. The boys are a little rattled at first, but it passes, as it always does. Then the turbulence gets worse. The plane is shaking so violently that bags are falling out of the overhead bins, and before we know it, the plane crashes into a mountain. It's a gruesome scene. Legs are breaking from the impact. People are being crushed. Some of them are being pulled out of the window due to the loss of cabin pressure. When the plane finally comes to a stop, some succumb to their injuries right away. One of the guys tries to get the captain to help them, but the captain is barely alive. He's bleeding out of the mouth. In any case, nothing works. None of the dials in the cockpit or the radio. That evening, the survivors freeze and try their best to keep warm, and they make it through the night. It's absolutely miserable though, and obviously not everybody makes it. The next day they get to work separating the wounded to be cared for, finding food and other supplies to ration. They also remove the dead from the plane. We do hear what sounds like a plane passing overhead, but of course it doesn't see the boys, even though they're all shouting for help from the ground and trying to get its attention. Marcelo, the captain of the team, believes that they'll be rescued tomorrow, but Fito isn't so optimistic, although he doesn't openly disagree with Marcelo. For now, at least, it's probably best not to lose hope on day one. By day 3, one of the guys, Nando, is in extremely bad shape. He gathers his strength and he goes over to his sister, who also looks like she won't pull through. Fito, the pragmatic one, starts melting ice so that they have water to drink. The boys also try to make a sign to mark that they're there for any planes that may be passing overhead. They do see another plane and they try everything to get its attention, using mirrors in the sun as reflectors. They shout. They're certain that they've been seen and will be saved. Perhaps the plane will turn around or alert other rescue teams. Some are already cheering in relief, but their hopes are soon dashed when nobody circles back for them. They start fantasizing then about the food that they wish they could eat, and the work continues. A medical student helps out the injured. They think they hear something again, but it's a false alarm, so Fito starts making a plan to go on a search based on the trajectory of the planes that they saw flying overhead. Today though, while they did hear the planes flying overhead, they didn't see them. Could be that the planes are still circling the area searching for them though. They wonder how much longer they can survive out there with dwindling supplies, and one of the guys tells them about the rule of threes. You can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. They're also burning more calories in the cold at that high altitude, so that doesn't help. But they do make a plan to get to the tail of the plane to get the batteries that might make the radio work. Obviously, the tail of the plane is quite a walk away. They're pretty resourceful at making protection goggles from the materials that they have on hand, and then they go on their trek. After some walking, Fito realizes that he can't see the plane, their crash site, from where he is, so it could be that the rescue planes can't see it either. By day 6, they've split the last of the saltine crackers, and they're already seriously starving at this point. There is nothing left. One of the boys eats his own scab. Fito tells another that he was told that Nando, the one with his sister, who was in bad shape, is starting to lose his mind, and that Nando said he refuses to starve to death. He'll eat the bodies if he needs to. Roberto eventually says what a lot of the guys are thinking but are too scared to say at this point out loud. As they're huddled up for warmth in the plane, they debate the pros and cons amongst themselves. They'll certainly die if they don't get any kind of food or nutrients anytime soon, and it's necessary for survival, but would God forgive them if they did this? Is it even legal? It's heartbreaking when they all agree that even organ donors have to give their consent for their organs to be harvested. They can't just use or consume bodies without consent. The discussion that results from their internal conflict over whether or not to do this is really interesting because they seriously consider the ethics of it, and I did find that surprising. It also gives you a really good idea of the character of the boys. Some of the boys get so desperate that they eat shoelaces, cigarettes, and their urine is also a very concerning dark brown color at this point. Eventually, Nando's sister Susie dies in his arms. By day 9, one of the guys tells the group that he gives his consent for the rest of them to consume him if he dies. A few others also openly give their consent. In a heartbreaking moment, another guy hands him a shard of glass and he leaves the plane, and I thought for a while that he was going out to take his life, but he goes out to the bodies buried in the snow. Some of the other guys, unable to bear their hunger, go out to join them. Only Marcelo, Numa, and some others remain. Daniel, one of the guys who went outside, struggles with feeling guilty, and he thinks that he's being judged for this. They do eventually figure out a system, though, to have the least amount of people exposed to the trauma of actually harvesting the meat. Vito would choose the bodies, and none of the other survivors would know who he chose. And the Storch cousins would cut them up, clean them, and make them as edible as possible into small bite-sized pieces like biltong. All things considered, they're fairly decent guys and they do their best to keep things dignified for their lost friends. Pancho tries to get Numa to eat, telling him that it's not as bad with a bit of snow, but Numa still refuses. One day, they find some batteries and a portable radio, and they get enough signal to hear a radio broadcast that the search for them is now over. This devastates the boys. The broadcast announces that in the last 10 days, 66 search and rescue missions were conducted using 17 planes from the Chilean, Uruguayan, and Argentinian Air Force. The search will resume next year when the ice thaws to give the searchers better visibility. Obviously, at that point, they'll be searching for bodies and the wreckage. Marcelo admits to the group then that he was wrong and he made them wait for nothing, so they may as well eat. He and another holdout also eat. Another smaller group go out on a mission to look for the tail end of the plane, and on one of these missions, Numa finds his friend Gaston, who was thrown out of the plane as it was in the process of crashing. They find other bodies in the snow of the passengers who were thrown out as the plane went down. They do make the not very smart decision to keep going, and they end up being trapped on the side of the mountain overnight, but against all odds, they somehow survive the night. Nando, who is now looking a lot healthier, tells Numa that he needs to eat to get his strength up because Chile is on the other side of the mountains and they need to get there. Numa eventually reluctantly eats, struggling to chew, and he forces himself to swallow. He considers for the first time then that he may not get back home, but he sees Nando training every day to go to Chile and he's determined to go with him. By day 17, the boys all clearly have their strength back, enough that they laugh and make some small jokes as they're huddled in the plane. They tell each other stories about life on the mountain, and just then, because we can't have nice things, their plane gets buried by an avalanche. A lot of the guys are trapped and suffocating under the heavy pressure of the snow. They're shouting for help. There's a snowstorm outside as well, so there's nowhere to really go. They start digging each other out, and I had to skip this for a little bit because it's the stuff of absolute nightmares. They do a roll call then, and they have lost some people, including the team captain Marcelo. Marcelo did die a peaceful death though. He just stopped feeling anything. Gustavo, Diego, Daniel, Lillian don't make it either, and the boys all start praying frantically. Numa's birthday comes round while they're trapped in what looks like pretty much the whole mountain on top of them. On day 18, they've been buried for 2 days, their hunger becoming unbearable, and Numa says that up until this point it was the Strauss cousins who had been able to make the meat, just meat, meaning the boys never had to be directly confronted with what they were eating. Now they're going to have to make another plan for themselves because they're all trapped in the plane. They need to eat to survive, and they're going to have to eat in a more barbaric way. One of the guys goes and he consumes and gives a bite to one of the others. Some of them start crying, and that's when Numa starts digging. By day 20, they've been buried for 4 days, and that's when Numa eventually sees the sky and the boys start to climb out. They celebrate being alive then, but Numa does have a concerning cut on his leg. He injured himself while he was trying to dig them out. Boys get to work then digging the plane out as well. On day 34, the thaw begins, but they're losing another one of their own, Arturo, who has been on a steady decline for some time. His lungs are filled with liquid, and there's nothing that the medical students or others can do for him except make him comfortable. They eventually add him to the other bodies in the snow. On day 36, 4 of the guys volunteer to go downhill on another trek, but Numa's ankle doesn't look like it's going to hold up for this hike, or it could just be that he's forcing his foot into the shoe because he has so many layers of socks. The group doesn't get very far, and Numa's leg gives out, causing him to pass out, and he decides to go back to the plane alone. His foot is infected. He feels useless, and without antibiotics, I don't know, it's not looking good. They say that they walked 2 to 3 hours east, and they found the tail end of the plane behind the hill. They also found some supplies in there. They found the plane's batteries. Since Roberto fixed the portable radio, he thinks that he can fix this one as well. They do get it to work and they send out a message, but at the time there's nobody responding to their radio calls. The boys start running out of food again, the rations aren't enough, so they do the unimaginable and they just start stripping meat from the bones. We see one of the boys just take meat from a rib cage. They've stopped caring too. They don't descend into barbarism or anything, it's just that they're so desperate and starving that the survival instinct kind of takes over. There is no debating it or trying to hide it anymore. Numa's condition is worsening and he thinks that he's dying, and he tells Nando that he gives his consent for them to consume his body. Back at the tail end of the plane, things aren't going well, so they leave a message on the window saying that there are 17 more survivors. The boys head back to base camp and they use some of the supplies that they found at the tail of the plane to make a waterproof sleeping bag so that they may survive the elements overnight on their next big trek. They also do hear on their portable radio that the search for them has resumed. Numa dies on December 11th in his sleep. Oh man, I thought that since he was the narrator, somehow he would be safe, even though this is never a predictor of a character making it. In his pocket, the boys find a note that reads that there is no greater love than to give one's life for friends. A group of guys pack supplies and head out for their next big trek west to go to Chile. They huddle in a single makeshift sleeping bag overnight, freezing and carrying on walking the next day. Eventually they reach the top, but all they can see is still so much mountain. Nando says he won't go back. They've come too far. He asks Roberto to go with him, but Roberto thinks that this is a death sentence, but they both end up carrying on west. And the other two decide to go back to the plane so that Nando and Roberto have food that lasts longer. Nando is certain that they'll make it to the 2 peaks that aren't covered in snow, and they'll make it in 10 days, which is about the amount of food that they have. But it's not looking good. Roberto also looks like he suffers from a bout of food poisoning. By some miracle though, they do make it to a place that has running water, which means civilization is nearby. Well, they do see a man on a horse on the other side of the river and they tell him their story, which very quickly gets to the authorities. In a scene that will have you crying like you haven't cried in a very long time, the guys back at the plane hear on the broadcast that Roberto and Nando have been found and they know their rescue is imminent. They really make an effort then in so much excitement, trying to comb their hair and brush their teeth as best they can. They're going home. They also take with them all the reminders of their friends. They're eventually collected by helicopters and return from the Andes on December 22nd, 1972. 16 of them, and they reunited with their families. In his narration, Numa says that the homecoming for the guys was very overwhelming and they were named the heroes of the Andes, only they didn't feel like heroes. They were dead, like the others, only they got to go home. And we do see in the final scenes, after the joy of coming home and being reunited with their families, the boys have to cope with their survivor's guilt, and yeah, that is Society of the Snow. Generally, when a movie is based on a true story, I go and read up on that story, but once again, I'm nowhere near ready, so I think I'm just going to sit with the movie a bit. If you have seen the movie, feel free to share your thoughts, but once again, I would highly recommend this one. It was so memorable, and thank you for watching.